Hey there, this is Anne Marie, the anti-HR lady, and what I want to talk to you today about is differentiating between what discrimination is and what it is not. I often have people come to me and they are coming to me because they need to deal with a discriminatory situation at their work, or they're dealing with an outright discriminatory hostile work environment, and they want to negotiate their way out with a separation with severance. But there are often times when individuals will come to me claiming that they're dealing with discrimination at work, but when we unpack what is actually happening at their workplace, it's not discrimination. I will say that a majority of the time that people that come to me with claims of discrimination have legitimate claims, but there are times when people come to me with issues around discrimination when in fact what they're dealing with is poor management, unfair treatment, but that doesn't rise to the level of discrimination, unprofessionalism in their workplace, toxicity in their workplace that is not necessarily discrimination. And so I think it's important for us to understand and have a common understanding of what discrimination is and what it isn't. So in this video, I'm going to just briefly summarize for you what discrimination is and what it isn't, and give you some examples so that you can spot discrimination, legitimate discrimination in your workplace when it occurs, and that you can also understand the difference between that and other types of behavior that you may witness and deal with at work that are not discrimination, though they may in fact be unprofessional and be examples of problematic management, and they may actually violate your company's policies, but they don't rise to the level of discrimination. It's important to understand what discrimination is, because if an employer is engaging in behavior that is illegal discrimination, you can hold them accountable for that by bringing it to their attention and negotiating your way out with a separation with severance. I've explained many times why trying to stay in an environment like that after you raise a claim of discrimination to human resources is likely not going to end up with a good result for you. So if you decide that you want to confront discrimination at work, you should have a plan for how you're going to exit, so that you exit on your own terms, and that in most cases you exit with a check in hand from your employer. I am teaching a masterclass on April 13th. It's a live masterclass where I will teach you how to request an exit from a discriminatory hostile workplace with cash and actually get it. I'll teach you how to ask for an exit from an employer who's engaging in discriminatory behavior and make your case in a manner most likely for them to cut the check. So if you're interested in that, there's a link in bio to register for the class. It will be live and replays will be available thereafter. You will get a free replay if you register for the class. And it will be at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on April 13th. Now, let's talk about what discrimination is and what it isn't. Discrimination refers to any kind of unfair treatment that a person is subjected to based on a protected characteristic such as race, ethnicity, nation of origin, sex, religion, ability, and age. And in some cases, there may also be protections based on gender identity and gender orientation, but the federal law protects the characteristics that I just mentioned. Here are some examples of discrimination that you should look out for. If you are a person who has any of the protected characteristics that I just mentioned, either individual ones or combination of them, if you are subjected to any of these kinds of things that I mentioned, you are more likely being discriminated against at work, and you have every right to raise it as a claim to your employer and seek a separation with severance. Hiring or promotions based on any factors other than qualifications and experience. Paying different wages to employees who perform the same job, where the differential wages are clearly based on you not being a member with any of the protected characteristics that I mentioned. So in other words, if the decision is clearly being made where people who have certain protected characteristics are receiving less pay than people who do not. For example, if you do the same job as another employee, but you have a disability and they do not, and you get paid less, that's a problem. Subjecting employees to harassment or hostile work environment because they belong to one of the protected classes that I just mentioned, or have one or more of the protected characteristics that I just mentioned. Retaliating against an employee because they raise claims of discrimination. And it doesn't matter whether those claims are legitimate in the eyes of the employer or human resources. If they engage in retaliation against you because you raise claims of discrimination, that in and of itself is a problem. And it is also an actionable claim that you can bring to your employer's attention, as well as a claim that you might also be able to bring in court. Firing or demoting employees based on their protected characteristics or belonging to protected classes that I just mentioned. Protected characteristics and protected classes are interchangeable, but they mean the same thing. If you belong to any of the groups that I mentioned or a combination, if your employer fires you or demotes you on that basis, that's an example of discrimination. Here are some other examples that are definite discrimination red flags. Refusing to hire someone because they exhibit a protected characteristic. For example, a woman is visibly pregnant and so they decide not to give her the job. That's an example of discrimination. Or a person has a obvious disability when they come in for an interview and so they decide not to give them the job. That's discrimination. Subjecting an employee to racist comments and racist jokes, that is a clear type of discrimination that occurs quite commonly in workplaces. People make offhand comments and they dismiss them as, oh, I was just joking, or I was just repeating something I saw on television. That's an example of discrimination. Paying a female employer less than a male employer and making comments like, oh, well, her husband has a job, so she doesn't need to make as much as a man does, or those kinds of things. Or thinking in terms of making decisions about pay and pay equity is an example of discrimination. Now, let's talk a little bit about what discrimination is not. Because I think most of the example I just gave, it's pretty obvious to you. Yes, that sounds discriminatory. But let me give you some examples of things that may occur in the workplace that on its face, and when I say on its face, unless you can bring in some other dimension, that means that if you can bring in a proof that what the person did is tied to one of those protected classes, then it may be discrimination. But if it just occurs on its face without a discriminatory dimension, this may not necessarily be discrimination. Giving negative feedback about an employee's performance. I often have people come to me because they got negative feedback on their performance. Now, if you get negative feedback on your performance after you've raised a claim of discrimination, that's an issue. But if separate, you've never raised any claim, and your boss just feels that you're not performing your job up to snuff, that in and of itself is not discrimination. You have to engage in some self-reflection and determine whether, in fact, what you're being told is legitimate. Even though you may not like to hear it, it doesn't mean that it is discrimination. However, if your supervisor seeks to raise issues with your performance after you have raised a claim of discrimination in the workplace, that could be considered retaliatory, and that may in fact be a problem. Not getting promoted due to not having the job experience or qualifications required is not discrimination. So just because you get passed over for promotion and you're Black and the person who got the job is white does not mean it's discrimination. What you want to look at is whether or not they in fact have more qualifications or experience than you for that position. If they do not, then you may have a legitimate claim of discrimination, especially if you can show a pattern and practice of your employer promoting people who are not who do not have protected class characteristics over people who do. But if on its face, you don't get promoted because you don't have the job qualifications and experience required, that's not discrimination. Termination due to violation of a company policy or poor performance is not on its face discrimination. Again, if you can show that you were terminated due to your raising a claim of discrimination, that could be considered retaliatory. which is a problem. But if in fact you broke a company rule, you did something that was wrong, and you're fired for it, that on its face is not discrimination. You have to really go to look at the underlying cause and whether or not there are examples of other people doing something that you're being fired for that they weren't fired for. Then you might be able to bring a wrongful termination claim after the fact. However, if in fact you engaged in, behavior that goes against company policy, or you violated a serious company policy and you're terminated, just because you're Black or just because you're a woman doesn't mean that it's discrimination. For example, I once had a man come to me, and he was a Black man, come to me and tell me that he felt that his employer was messing with him because he was Black, because they put him on probation for having an inappropriate contact with an intern. And I had to say, sir, you're lucky they didn't fire you. So again, in that particular case, he violated a serious company policy, and I was not going to let him come and talk to me, and I definitely wasn't going to take him as a client just because he was Black. I was like, did you in fact do what they accused you of? Yes, he said. But, I think they're making a big deal out of it. And I stopped him right there and I said, sir, you're lucky they didn't fire you, because if I was making a decision, you probably wouldn't have a job. So again, if you break company policy and they decide to fire you or take disciplinary action against you, just because you are in a protected characteristic does not mean that they're discriminating against you. Sometimes people do things that they deserve to be fired for, regardless of what their protected status might be. So again, decisions based on seniority or experience are not discriminatory. Now, if you can show again that they are favoring certain groups of people over other groups of people, and the people who they're favoring are consistently don't have certain protected classes, that might be discrimination. But if on its face, employees with more seniority and experience get certain opportunities across the board, and you don't get that opportunity because you don't have the seniority and experience, that is not discrimination. You have to be able to show that a decision, more likely than not, is being made because you belong to a protected class or several protected classes in order to be able to prove discrimination, and you have to be able to prove it. Feelings are not proof. I often have to say this to potential clients. Feelings are not proof. Hurt feelings are not proof. Being upset at the way your manager talked to you is not discrimination. It might be inappropriate. It might be wrong. But that on its face is not discrimination because your manager didn't talk to you in the tone of voice that you would like, right? Bullying, unfortunately, is not illegal. So if your manager is bullying you, they might be violating company policy. And if they're doing it because you belong to a protected class and you can prove that they clearly on a regular basis bully you and other people like you while they exclude other people, that's a clear example of discrimination. But if your manager comes in and they're just a jerk to everyone every single day, then that's not necessarily discrimination, but it's definitely an example of a toxic work environment. So it's important to understand the difference. So these are just some examples of what discrimination is and what discrimination is not. I think it's really important for us, especially those of us who are people of color and especially Black people and Black women, to know what discrimination is and what discrimination is not, so that you are ready to hold employers accountable, hold your employer accountable when they're engaging in behavior that is discriminatory. So if everything is discrimination, then nothing is discrimination. So I think it's very important for us to really know it when we see it, be able to document it, know how to legitimately and effectively raise these claims to human resources so that we can walk away with some money in our pocket and move on to opportunities where we will not be subjected to discrimination, right? While those opportunities are rare in America for Black folk, they do exist, right? And so I want those of us who feel that we are legitimately being discriminated against to have plans and options for how to walk away from those situations on our terms. So it's very important for us to know what discrimination is and what discrimination is not. So I really hope that this has been a really helpful video for those of you watching it. I hope that you will consider enrolling in my masterclass. I think it will be very helpful for those of you who are in situations where you're being subjected to discrimination. And so I invite you to check out the link in bio and participate in the masterclass on April 13th. This is Anne Marie, the anti-HR lady, reminding you that HR is not your enemy, but they're definitely not your friend, but I am. I'll see you in the next video.